Welcome to Craftlit, the podcast for crafters who love books. My name is Heather Ordover, and I'm podcasting from where the Delaware River meets the Old York Road, New Hope, Pennsylvania. Episode 603, Free Cycling. This episode of Craftlit is brought to you by you. Thank you. Well, hello. How are you? I am well. I had a lovely walk the last few mornings across the Delaware. The air was cool and dry, and I know that this is not good in general, but it was really nice anyway. I loved it. And I've been taking pictures pretty much every morning of the Delaware, and I think I should be doing something with that. I'll come up with something. But free cycling. Free cycling is a thing here. It's a thing many places where you can just post, hey, I've got this stuff and I'm going to leave it out in front of the house and people will come pick it up. And it works a little different here in New Hope, I think, but I'm going to figure it out because I have a bunch of stuff that I don't really want to take all the way out to the thrift store. It's not all that close. And I feel like I'll move it along out of here faster if I don't have to keep looking at the box that needs to go to the recycling place or the thrift store. Anyway, that plus, you may actually be able to hear there's recycling water on my desk. I had a big glass bowl and all of these shells and really pretty little rocks that I'd collected at Cape May over the years, and then Delaware River rocks that I've collected over the last, I don't know, 2 months or so. Interesting ones, little pieces of cracked pottery that showed up because the water level is so low in the Delaware that things are uncovered. So I took a recycling pump, a little mini sump pump, and put it at the bottom of the big glass bowl, and there is recycling water on my desk, which is lovely. And it keeps me happy during the day because I can see it sparkle and hear it go, and that's kind of fun. I am also recycling the upstairs room that used to be held by the 2 children. Aaron comes back from time to time for the weekend, and that bed is not moving anywhere. But Aiden's 3,000 miles away now, so I'm reclaiming that side of the room. Actually, I'm just taking back my desk that Aiden was using, and all the sewing stuff is going to move up there, and probably some art stuff too. And by doing that move, I know I will discover duplicates and things that I don't need anymore or won't use, and I'll be able to free cycle those as well. So that's kind of where my head's at right now. That and, painting and stuff. I got to go up and spend a spectacular weekend with my friend Pam, who I've mentioned before, who has the gorgeous art on Instagram. She teaches classes. She's really spectacular. She and I have very different painting styles, although I'm trying to learn to do more of what she does as a style that I can access when I want it. We went looking for lichen on sticks and mushrooms on sticks and small logs, and it's just really cool. And I learned a lot. I especially learned that I really like lakes early in the morning in August. I think that's pretty much it. There were some other mom squatters up there, so it was just a really nice break and a very, very needed, okay, I'm back home, but it's not home like it used to be anymore, so let's do something different, change it up weekend. And I will be forever grateful to Pam for letting me come do that. That was very, very, very good. And I will get my act together and share some of my really, I love them, early morning pictures from the lake so that you can see them on Instagram, on my Instagram account. That's about it with me. But what about Joan? I know we are closing in on the end of the book. I haven't really calculated how many more weeks it's going to be before we hit the end, but we are today going to see the first days of her testimony. Mark Twain makes a big deal about making sure that this part is accurate. It is. Even though Louis de Camp was a real person, was part of Joan's army, and could read and write, he did not hold the position in this first trial that Twain utilizes him as. However, the other guy that he does talk about, Monchamp, that was the real guy. That's the guy who wound up showing up at the rehabilitation trial years later and testifying as to what Couchon and the rest of the bad guys were trying to do to Joan in railroading her. And again, all of this was written down at the time, and I continue to be so impressed at how well Joan held her own. And you're going to start hearing some of that in the third chapter we listened to today. Chapter 4 and Chapter 5 are trial prep, getting everything lined up. They're not very long. And then the longest chapter today is Chapter 6, The Maid Baffles Her Persecutors. In this chapter, Joan says something that might not make a whole lot of sense to you. We haven't really talked about this element of Joan's world much. I know I've mentioned it in passing before, but where Joan was from, Domremy, it's a province, it's an area, it's the hinterlands. It's not on a main route where people are going to just go through the town the way that they might on their way to Paris, going through a larger city, or to Reims or wherever. As a consequence, because of what was going on politically with the 100 Years' War, and because of how travel worked, we've talked about this before on the podcast. You know, the stories like Little Red Riding Hood make a lot more sense when you remember that when those were written, last names were really pretty new at the time. People pretty much lived in their own towns and didn't really travel a whole ton, especially not during the 100 Years' War. And as a consequence, you wound up feeling more connected to your parish, to your very, very local environment than you did to the country within which that parish existed. Why do I bring this all up? Because today you're going to hear Joan, as part of her testimony, saying, when I came into France, I heard this. When I went to France, the voices told me to go to France. To our modern ears, we're like, girlfriend, you're in France already. So I don't know what you're talking about. It's leaving her home and going into France that's part of a political environment, France that is being controlled by kings and treaties and things like that. Whereas in Domremy, your life is still pretty much governed by the seasons and your church and the priest who's running the place, and that's it. So it didn't sound to me like it made sense at first, and then I went, oh, right, okay, I got it. End of the 100 Years' War. Of course she talks that way. Just like in the United States pre-Civil War, people would say, I'm a citizen of Massachusetts, I'm a citizen of Virginia, not so much I'm a citizen of the United States. We became unified and the United States as a matter of course, as the way people spoke about this place. We became that after the Civil War. Prior to that, we were all pretty much colonies and then states. All right, let's listen to Personal Recollections of Joan of Arc by Mark Twain, Book 3, Chapters 4 through 6, read for us by John Greenman. Here we go.
Personal Recollections of Joan of Arc, Volume 2, Book 3, Chapter 4, All Ready to Condemn. On Tuesday, the 20th of February, while I sat at my master's work in the evening, he came in, looking sad, and said it had been decided to begin the trial at 8 o'clock the next morning, and I must get ready to assist him. Of course, I had been expecting such news every day for many days, but no matter, the shock of it almost took my breath away, and set me trembling like a leaf. I suppose that without knowing it I had been half imagining that at the last moment something would happen, something that would stop this fatal trial, Maybe that La Hire would burst in at the gates with his hellions at his back. Maybe that God would have pity and stretch forth his mighty hand. But now there was no hope. The trial was to begin in the chapel of the fortress, and would be public. So I went sorrowing away and told Noel, so that he might be there early and secure a place. It would give him a chance to look again upon the face which we so revered, and which was so precious to us. All the way, both going and coming, I plowed through chattering and rejoicing multitudes of English soldiery and English-hearted French citizens. There was no talk but of the coming event. Many times I heard the remark, accompanied by a pitiless laugh, "The fat bishop has got things as he wants them at last, and says he will lead the vile witch a merry dance and a short one." But here and there I glimpsed compassion and distress in a face, and it was not always a French one. English soldiers feared Joan, but they admired her for her great deeds and her unconquerable spirit. In the morning Manchon and I went early, yet as we approached the vast fortress we found crowds of men already there and still others gathering. The chapel was already full, and the way barred against further admissions of unofficial persons. We took our appointed places. Throned on high sat the president, Cochon, Bishop of Beauvais, in his grand robes, and before him in rows sat his robed court, 50 distinguished ecclesiastics, men of high degree in the Church, of clear-cut intellectual faces, men of deep learning, veteran adepts in strategy and casuistry, practiced setters of traps for ignorant minds and unwary feet. When I looked around upon this army of masters of legal fence, gathered here to find just one verdict and no other, and remembered that Joan must fight for her good name and her life single-handed against them, I asked myself what chance an ignorant poor country girl of 19 could have in such an unequal conflict, and my heart sank down low, very low. When I looked again at that obese president, puffing and wheezing there, his great belly distending and receding with each breath, and noted his 3 chins, fold above fold, and his knobby and knotty face, and his purple and splotchy complexion, and his repulsive cauliflower nose, and his cold and malignant eyes, a brute, every detail of him, my heart sank lower still. And when I noted that all were afraid of this man, and shrank and fidgeted in their seats when his eye smote theirs, my last poor ray of hope dissolved away and wholly disappeared. There was one unoccupied seat in this place, and only one. It was over against the wall, in view of everyone. It was a little wooden bench without a back, and it stood apart and solitary on a sort of dais. Tall men-at-arms in morion, breastplate, and steel gauntlets stood as stiff as their own halberts on each side of this dais, but no other creature was near by it. A pathetic little bench to me it was, for I knew whom it was for, and the sight of it carried my mind back to the great court at Poitiers, where Joan sat upon one like it, and calmly fought her cunning fight with the astonished doctors of the Church and Parliament, and rose from it victorious and applauded by all, and went forth to fill the world with the glory of her name. What a dainty little figure she was, and how gentle and innocent! How winning and beautiful in the fresh bloom of her 17 years! Those were grand days, and so recent, for she was just 19 now, and how much she had seen since, and what wonders she had accomplished. But now, oh, all was changed now. She had been languishing in dungeons, away from light and air and the cheer of friendly faces, for nearly 3/4 of a year. She, born child of the sun, natural comrade of the birds and of all happy free creatures. She would be weary now, and worn with this long captivity, her forces impaired, despondent perhaps, as knowing there was no hope. Yes, all was changed. All this time there had been a muffled hum of conversation, and rustling of robes and scraping of feet on the floor, a combination of dull noises which filled all the place. Suddenly, "Produce the accused!" It made me catch my breath. My heart began to thump like a hammer. But there was silence now, silence absolute. All those noises ceased, and it was as if they had never been, not a sound. The stillness grew oppressive. It was like a weight upon one. All faces were turned toward the door, and one could properly expect that. for most of the people there suddenly realized, no doubt, that they were about to see, in actual flesh and blood, what had been to them before only an embodied prodigy, a word, a phrase, a world-girdling name. The stillness continued. Then, far down the stone-paved corridors, one heard a vague, slow sound approaching. Clank, clink, clank. Joan of Arc, deliverer of France, in chains. My head swam. All things whirled and spun about me. Ah, I was realizing, too. End of chapter 4. Book 3, Chapter 5, 50 Experts Against a Novice. I give you my honor now that I am not going to distort or discolor the facts of this miserable trial. No, I will give them to you honestly, detail by detail, just as Manchon and I set them down daily in the official record of the court, and just as one may read them in the printed histories. There will be only this difference, that in talking familiarly with you I shall use my right to comment upon the proceedings and explain them as I go along, so that you can understand them better. Also, I shall throw in trifles which came under our eyes and have a certain interest for you and me, and were not important enough to go into the official record. Footnote number 1. He kept his word. His account of the great trial will be found to be in strict and detailed accordance with the sworn facts of history. Translator. End of note 1. To take up my story now where I left off, we heard the clanking of Joan's chains down the corridors. She was approaching. Presently she appeared. A thrill swept the house, and one heard deep breaths drawn. 2 guardsmen followed her at a short distance to the rear. Her head was bowed a little, and she moved slowly, she being weak and her irons heavy. She had on men's attire, all black, a soft woolen stuff, intensely black, funereally black, not a speck of relieving color in it from her throat to the floor. A wide collar of this same black stuff lay in radiating folds upon her shoulders and breast. The sleeves of her doublet were full, down to the elbows, and tight thence to her manacled wrists. Below the doublet, tight black hose down to the chains on her ankles. Half-way to her bench she stopped, just where a wide shaft of light fell slanting from a window, and slowly lifted her face. Another thrill. It was totally colorless, white as snow. A face of gleaming snow set in vivid contrast upon that slender statue of somber, unmitigated black. It was smooth and pure and girlish, beautiful beyond belief, infinitely sad and sweet. But dear, dear, when the challenge of those untamed eyes fell upon that judge, and the droop vanished from her form, and it straightened up soldierly and noble, my heart leapt for joy, and I said, all is well, all is well. They have not broken her, they have not conquered her, she is Joan of Arc still. Yes, it was plain to me now that there was one spirit there which this dreaded judge could not quell nor make afraid. She moved to her place and mounted the dais and seated herself upon her bench, gathering her chains into her lap and nestling her little white hands there. Then she waited in tranquil dignity, the only person there who seemed unmoved and unexcited. A bronzed and brawny English soldier, standing at martial ease in the front rank of the citizen spectators, did now most gallantly and respectfully put up his great hand and give her the military salute, and she, smiling friendly, put up hers and returned it, whereat there was a sympathetic little break of applause, which the judge sternly silenced. Now the memorable inquisition, called in history the Great Trial, began. 50 experts against a novice, and no one to help the novice. The judge summarized the circumstances of the case and the public reports and suspicions upon which it was based. Then he required Joan to kneel and make oath that she would answer with exact truthfulness to all questions asked her. Joan's mind was not asleep. It suspected that dangerous possibilities might lie hidden under this apparently fair and reasonable demand. She answered with the simplicity which so often spoiled the enemy's best-laid plans in the trial at Poitiers, and said, "No, for I do not know what you are going to ask me. You might ask of me things which I would not tell you." This incensed the court, and brought out a brisk flurry of angry exclamations. Joan was not disturbed. Cochon raised his voice and began to speak in the midst of this noise, but he was so angry that he could hardly get his words out. He said, "With the divine assistance of our Lord, we require you to expedite these proceedings for the welfare of your conscience. Swear with your hands upon the Gospels that you will answer true to the questions which shall be asked you." And he brought down his fat hand with a crash upon his official table. Joan said, with composure, "As concerning my father and mother, and the faith, and what things I have done since my coming into France, I will gladly answer. But as regards the revelations which I have received from God, my voices have forbidden me to confide them to any save my king." Here there was another angry outburst of threats and expletives, and much movement and confusion, so she had to stop and wait for the noise to subside. Then her waxen face flushed a little, and she straightened up and fixed her eye on the judge, and finished her sentence in a voice that had the old ring to it, "And I will never reveal these things, though you cut my head off." Well, maybe you know what a deliberative body of Frenchmen is like. The judge and half the court were on their feet in a moment, and all shaking their fists at the prisoner, and all storming and vituperating at once, so that you could hardly hear yourself think. They kept this up several minutes, and because Joan sat untroubled and indifferent, they grew madder and noisier all the time. Once she said, with a fleeting trace of the old-time mischief in her eye and manner, "Prithee, speak one at a time, fair lords, then I will answer all of you." At the end of 3 whole hours of furious debating over the oath, the situation had not changed a jot. The bishop was still requiring an unmodified oath. Joan was refusing for the 20th time to take any except the one which she had herself proposed. There was a physical change apparent, but it was confined to the court and judge. They were hoarse, droopy, exhausted by their long frenzy, and had a sort of haggard look in their faces, poor men, whereas Joan was still placid and reposeful, and did not seem noticeably tired. The noise quieted down. There was a waiting pause of some moments' duration. Then the judge surrendered to the prisoner, and with bitterness in his voice told her to take the oath after her own fashion. Joan sunk at once to her knees, and as she laid her hands upon the Gospels, that big English soldier set free his mind. "By God, if she were but English, she were not in this place another half a second." It was the soldier in him responding to the soldier in her. But what a stinging rebuke it was, what an arraignment of French character and French royalty! Would that he could have uttered just that one phrase in the hearing of Orleans. I know that that grateful city, that adoring city, would have risen to the last man and the last woman, and marched upon Rouen. Some speeches that shame a man and humble him, burn themselves into the memory and remain there. That one is burned into mine. After Joan had made oath, Cochon asked her name, and where she was born, and some questions about her family; also what her age was. She answered these. Then he asked her how much education she had. "I have learned from my mother the Pater Noster, the Ave Maria, and the Belief. All that I know was taught me by my mother." Questions of this unessential sort dribbled on for a considerable time. Everybody was tired out by now, except Joan. The tribunal prepared to rise. At this point Cochon forbade Joan to try to escape from prison, upon pain of being held guilty of the crime of heresy. Singular logic. She answered simply, "I am not bound by this proposition. If I could escape, I would not reproach myself, for I have given no promise, and I shall not." Then she complained of the burden of her chains, and asked that they might be removed, for she was strongly guarded in that dungeon, and there was no need of them. But the bishop refused, and reminded her that she had broken out of prison twice before. Joan of Arc was too proud to insist. She only said, as she rose to go with the guard, "It is true, I have wanted to escape, and I do want to escape." Then she added, in a way that would touch the pity of anybody, I think, "It is the right of every prisoner." And so she went from the place in the midst of an impressive stillness, which made the sharper and more distressful to me the clank of those pathetic chains. What presence of mind she had! One could never surprise her out of it. She saw Noel and me there when she first took her seat on the bench, and we flushed to the forehead with excitement and emotion, but her face showed nothing, betrayed nothing. Her eyes sought us 50 times that day, but they passed on, and there was never any ray of recognition in them. Another would have started upon seeing us, and then there could have been trouble for us, of course. We walked slowly home together, each busy with his own grief and saying not a word. End of chapter 5. Volume 2, Book 3, Chapter 6, The Maid Baffles Her Persecutors. That night Manchon told me that all through the day's proceedings Cochon had had some clerks concealed in the embrasure of a window, who were to make a special report garbling Joan's answers and twisting them from their right meaning. Ah, that was surely the cruelest man, and the most shameless that has lived in this world. But his scheme failed. Those clerks had human hearts in them, and their base work revolted them, and they turned to and boldly made a straight report, whereupon Cochon cursed them, and ordered them out of his presence with a threat of drowning, which was his favorite and most frequent menace. The matter had gotten abroad, and was making great and unpleasant talk, and Cochon would not try to repeat this shabby game right away. It comforted me to hear that. When we arrived at the citadel next morning, we found that a change had been made. The chapel had been found too small. The court had now removed to a noble chamber situated at the end of the great hall of the castle. The number of judges was increased to 62, one ignorant girl against such odds, and none to help her. The prisoner was brought in. She was as white as ever, but she was looking no whit worse than she'd looked when she had first appeared the day before. Isn't it a strange thing? Yesterday she had sat 5 hours on that backless bench with her chains in her lap, baited, badgered, persecuted by that unholy crew, without even the refreshment of a cup of water, for she was never offered anything. And if I have made you know her by this time, you will know, without my telling you, that she was not a person likely to ask favors of those people. And she had spent the night caged in her wintry dungeon, with her chains upon her, yet here she was, as I say, collected, unworn, and ready for the conflict. Yes, and the only person there who showed no signs of the wear and worry of yesterday. And her eyes, ah, you should have seen them and broken your hearts. Have you seen that veiled deep glow, that pathetic hurt dignity, that unsubdued and unsubduable spirit that burns and smolders in the eye of a caged eagle, and makes you feel mean and shabby under the burden of its mute reproach? Her eyes were like that. How capable they were, and how wonderful! Yes, at all times and in all circumstances they could express as by print every shade of the wide range of her moods. In them were hidden floods of gay sunshine, the softest and peacefulest twilights, and devastating storms and lightnings. Not in this world have there been others that were comparable to them. Such is my opinion, and none that had the privilege to see them would say otherwise than this which I have said concerning them. The séance began, and how did it begin, should you think? Exactly as it began before, with that same tedious thing which had been settled once, after so much wrangling. The bishop opened thus: "You are required now to take the oath pure and simple, to answer truly all questions asked you." Joan replied placidly, "I have made oath yesterday, my lord. Let that suffice." The bishop insisted and insisted, with rising temper. Joan but shook her head and remained silent. At last she said, "I made oath yesterday. It is sufficient." Then she sighed and said, "Of a truth, you do burden me too much." The bishop still insisted, still commanded, but he could not move her. At last he gave it up and turned her over for the day's inquest to an old hand at tricks and traps and deceptive plausibilities, Beaupère, a doctor of theology,